Everyone else woke into this new world on a proper wooden boat, but one broke. Forgotten nobody woke up straddling nothing more than a single soaked, splintering plank. Exactly the kind of unfair, humiliating start that would have broken plenty of other people before the day even properly began. Forgotten nobody woke up straddling a single soaked plank, and the ocean itself seemed to laugh at the man to pour for a hole. That plank, laughably pathetic as it was about to become the seat of an entire ocean empire. He would look back on that single, humiliating detail many times in the days ahead, always with the same quiet, satisfied disbelief that something so small could grow into something so genuinely his own. Nobody watching that first pathetic morning would have guessed it, least of all Hashin himself. Soaked, furious, and certain he had drawn the worst possible hand in an already brutal, unforgiving game. Yet that was always the whole point of a good comeback story. That nobody ever sees it coming until it has already, quietly, completely arrived. He had every reason to despair in that exact moment, and yet something stubborn in him, the same instinct that had carried him through a lonely, difficult childhood, simply refused to let despair win. And the nobody clinging to it would soon be the man. Every drifting stranger came begging for survival. A man named Hashin opens his eyes to a boundless gray sea. The cold hit him first, then the salt, then the sheer, disorienting silence of open water stretching in every direction, with absolutely nothing familiar in sight. For one long, terrifying moment, his mind refused to accept any of it, clinging instead to the stubborn hope that he was still somehow safely asleep, in his own cramped apartment back on Blue Star, and a drizzling sky, straddling a single wooden plank, certain for one confused moment that he has simply died in his sleep. After a long night of gaming, a smooth, ungendered voice speaks directly inside his skull, welcoming him to the Lord Continent. The voice offered no comfort, no apology, only cold, practical instruction. And somehow that very bluntness steadied him more than gentle reassurance ever could have. In that first disorienting moment, explaining that he must find an island, plan his territory, and become a lord, while a goddess named Chenmo watches his every move. Opening his very first system panel, Hashin finds his stats humiliatingly plain. Level 1. No experience. For a moment he simply stared at the empty numbers, feeling the same old familiar sting of being handed less than everyone else, before deciding, quietly and deliberately, that less would simply have to be enough for now. He had felt that particular sting before, back on Blue Star, watching wealthier classmates receive things he could only ever dream about, and he recognized, with grim clarity, that this new world had simply found a fresh way to remind him of an old, familiar lesson. The lesson, as always, was the same one he had learned the hard way over and over throughout his entire life. That nobody was coming to hand him anything better, and that whatever he wanted, he would have to build himself, piece by careful piece. One basic support skill called Spirit Eye, and a talent field that simply reads none. A starving man handed reading glasses instead of a weapon, furious at being dropped into the ocean with nothing but a plank. While everyone else got an actual boat, he complains directly to the goddess Chenmo. And to his genuine shock, the system responds, confirming an initial error and granting one compensation draw, reaching blindly into a glowing box of unlabeled possibilities. That single blind reach, made purely on instinct with zero information to guide it, would end up shaping the entire rest of his story more than any careful, calculated decision that followed it. Later, looking back, he would marvel at how much of his entire fortune traced directly back to that one uninformed, desperate grab. Proof that sometimes the bravest decision is simply refusing to hesitate when hesitation cost more than action ever could. He pulls out a random gift package containing basic wood, plastic, copper, to fishing rods, blueprints, and one randomly rolled talent orb. The first real seeds of everything still to come. He immediately upgrades his sad plank into an actual small wooden boat, using his very first 10 units of wood. It was a small victory by any objective measure, yet it felt, in that exact moment, like the very first proof that his situation was not hopeless after all. He ran his hand along the new, slightly sturdier hull, feeling something close to genuine pride for the first time since waking. A small, private celebration nobody else on that entire empty ocean would ever know about or care to witness. That quiet pride, more than any system notification or leaderboard number, became the true fuel driving everything Hashin did for the rest of that long, exhausting first day. A 3-meter-long, deeply unimpressive vessel that is nonetheless a genuine miracle compared to drowning on bare timber. A map fragment item turns out to be the single most valuable thing in his entire starting haul. Every glance at that small pulsing dot reminded him that a goal, however distant, was worth infinitely more than the comfortable despair of simply drifting without direction. He found himself checking that dot obsessively in the days that followed. Not because its position ever changed, but because the simple act of confirming it was still there settled something anxious and restless in his chest, revealing a black dot representing an actual island somewhere out in the endless gray water. A destination when everyone else is nothing but drift and hope. Fishing with his basic rod to earn starter currency. Those first slow, patient hours taught him the value of small, steady effort, a lesson that would echo through every larger decision he made in the days that followed. Each small white stone that appeared in his account felt disproportionately significant proof, however tiny, that effort in this strange new world still translated into something real and countable. He learns the local economy fast, white stone for common fish, greater rewards for rarer catches, and begins quietly building the first few units of capital that will fund everything that follows. Then he finally uses his mysterious talent orb, and the system declares it epic quality. 100 transformations, capable of causing any item to undergo a positive random change 3 times daily. A slot machine that only ever pays out in his favor. Testing it immediately on scavenged wood, he pulls first a modest triple of wood. That very first cautious test, low stakes and low expectations, taught him more about the shape of his own luck than any careful reading of the item's description ever could have on its own. The modest result felt almost anticlimactic at first, until he realized that even a guaranteed small positive change was still infinitely better than the pure randomness everyone else on this ocean was gambling with every single day. Then a pet summoning card, and finally, astonishingly, an Ice Element Messenger class scroll, a purple epic item on his very first day. Proof that his luck has just fundamentally shifted. A realization that left him laughing out loud into the empty, indifferent rain. Proof that his luck has just fundamentally shifted. Using the pet card, a massive blue whale surfaces beside his little boat 5 meters long, radiating warmth and instant devotion, and Hashin names him Little Blue on the spot. The whale's low, affectionate cry pressed something warm and unfamiliar straight into Hashin's chest, a feeling he would only later recognize as the very first stirring of something like real companionship in this cold, unfamiliar world. Refusing to burn brain cells on anything fancier. That casual, almost dismissive naming would go on to become one of the most enduring relationships of his entire new life. Proof that meaningful bonds rarely announce themselves with fanfare. A resource fishing rod hauls in a legendary hero card next, and when he uses it, that single lucky pull, more than any other item in his entire starting haul, would go on to shape every single decision Hashin made for the rest of the voyage. Proof that sometimes the most valuable resource a person can find is simply the right ally at the right moment. A stunning golden-haired woman named Windsor materializes at the bow, bowing and calling him Lord, a legendary quality hero with healing, light arrow, and light shield already in her arsenal. Rather than admire her beauty, the pragmatic Hashin bluntly asks whether she can fish, prioritizing usefulness over looks in true survival fashion. It was, by any normal standard, an almost comically rude first impression to make on a legendary hero, and yet that very bluntness told Windsor more about her new lord's true character than any amount of flowery greeting ever could have. And Windsor, briefly recalibrating her judgment of him, smiles and agrees without hesitation. He discovers he can tow his growing boat by tying ropes to Little Blue, solving his propulsion problem entirely for free, while every other drifting player desperately searches for rowing materials and or-based technology instead. A brutal early battle against a purple-quality sea bright when Hornbeast tests his tiny crew badly, until Windsor's precise. That very first genuinely dangerous fight left Hashin shaken in a way no amount of fishing or scavenging ever had, a visceral reminder that this world's beauty always carried real, immediate teeth just beneath its con-gray surface. Merciless targeting of both its eyes blinds and finally kills it, dropping a genuine piece of purple equipment as reward. He learns quickly that quality tier determines nearly everything. That white, green, blue, purple, and golden legendary items, and monsters scale in a brutal exponential curve. Understanding that hierarchy early gave him a genuine tactical edge over players who kept charging blindly into fights, without first checking whether the numbers were even remotely in their favor, and that surviving even one purple encounter this early is a small miracle. Windsor and Little Blue level rapidly from combat, while Hashin himself levels more slowly, and he begins to suspect, correctly, that his own strength will increasingly come from the loyal, powerful companions surrounding him rather than his own raw stats. When the world announces a monthly Demon Domain event, opening a portal where killing rival lords grants rare merit points, the announcements send a ripple of nervous excitement through the entire world chat. Half the survivors thrilled at the prospect of easy loot, the other half quietly terrified at the idea of facing armed Desperate strangers instead of predictable sea beast. And full loot of their resources, Hashin crosses over and discovers an entirely new, far more lucrative form of income: other people. A rival spirit domain lord named No Senna tries to trick him into taking aggro from a dangerous jellyfish so she can escape unscathed. And once Hashin realizes he has been deliberately baited, the betrayal stung more than the danger itself. A sharp reminder that not every fellow human survivor on this ocean could be trusted simply because they share the same desperate circumstances. His easy generosity toward strangers hardens instantly into cold calculation. He hunts her down across the open water, negotiates briefly and mockingly, and when she still refuses to simply apologize or pay fairly, he has Windsor bind her and kills her personally with his own hands, inheriting every resource she owned in an instant. A terrified witness named Wang Mok, certain he is about to die next, instead finds Hashin surprisingly generous and fair in trade. The relief on Wang Mok's face in that moment was almost comical. A man bracing for execution suddenly handed a fair business deal instead, and that whiplash of emotion cemented a loyalty far stronger than fear alone could ever have produced. And Hashin deliberately spares him, using the encounter to seed a carefully engineered reputation as dangerous but honest. That single calculated act of mercy pays for itself many times over, as Wang Mok spreads glowing stories through the world chat, turning Hashin into a figure other players fear crossing but eagerly want to trade with, exactly as planned. Pouring his growing fortune into the game's brutal technology tree, Hashin learns the hard way that every meaningful upgrade, drainage, propulsion. He cursed the system more than once during these long, exhausting nights of budgeting, half convinced the entire technology tree had been designed by someone who genuinely enjoyed watching desperate lords go broke one purchase at a time. Thermal energy, diving, cost an exponentially punishing amount of white stone, turning progress into a constant, grinding financial battle. A second purple quality companion arrives when his talent produces a rare pet card, summoning a tiny fire elemental spirit named Hawawa. The moment she first curled against his shoulder, warm as a hand warmer and impossibly small, Hashin felt something soften in him that even Windsor's steady presence had not quite reached. A purely uncomplicated affection, who becomes both an adorable mascot and a genuinely vital source of heat, keeping the ship powered through the endless rain. Recruited commoners and a chef named Mori round out his growing crew, each given a fishing rod and a task. He made a point of learning each new arrival's name immediately, a small habit that cost him nothing but meant everything to people who had spent their entire sum in existence being treated as nothing more than disposable labor, transforming Hashin's operation from a single desperate survivor into something resembling an actual small, floating community. A near-catastrophic encounter with disguised glazing coral, an ambush predator capable of slowly turning his entire boat transparent, the side of his own hull beginning to fade into glass sent a genuine spike of panic through Hashin, sharper than anything a straightforward monster attack had produced, precisely because the danger looked so quiet and so easy to miss. And doomed to sink, teaches Hashin a harsh lesson that even low-level, low-quality creatures can be lethal if underestimated. Deeper hunting near an underwater mountain peak brings a genuinely dangerous fight against a blue-quality water shadow leopard, its agility so extreme that only Windsor and Wawa working in flawless. Watching the two of them anticipate each other's timing without a single spoken word left Hashin standing quietly aside, genuinely humbled by how far his small crew had grown beyond simple summon tools into something closer to true, independent partners. Practice coordination managed to bind and finally bring it down. Beside that leopard's territory stands a rare linguine gold fruit tree, its fruit capable of permanently boosting attributes, and after eating his fill, Hashin makes the bold decision to uproot the entire tree and sell it whole, earning an almost unbelievable to full gold stone. Flush with sudden, staggering wealth, he begins planning his next wave of upgrades, only for the entire underwater mountain to erupt into terrified chaos at the sound of a single. The sheer, primal fear rippling through even the strongest local predators told Hashin everything he needed to know before he ever laid eyes on the source, that whatever was coming outranked every single threat he had survived so far combined. Deep, majestic dragon's roar that freezes every creature on the peak in place, cloaking his boat in stealth. Hashin watches in stunned disbelief as an enormous royal procession approaches. Hundreds of giant black pythons, towering azure flood dragons hauling an actual floating palace, and rows of demi-human sea race soldiers standing at rigid attention. A cyan-robed third prince steps out onto the palace balcony, flanked by dragon women and graceful mermaids, sweeping his gaze slowly across the water until it settles, unmistakably. Hashin's heart hammered against his ribs, every survival instinct screaming at once. And yet he forced himself to stay perfectly, deliberately still, trusting the stealth cloak and the discipline that had carried him through every other impossible moment so far. Directly on the exact peak where Hashin's small stolen fortune is hiding. Whatever waits behind that terrifying, glittering procession, one thing is already certain. The broke nobody who once drifted on a single plank has built himself real power in less than a week. And he is not about to let a princess stare undo it now. Whatever came next, whether flight, fight, or simply continued patient waiting, Hashin intended to meet it the exact same way he had met every single test before it. With cold calculation, quiet courage, and the people he had earned standing steady beside him. Back on Blue Star, Hashin had been an orphan raised entirely on government aid. Alone his whole life. So a wall of strangers screaming into the world chat about being chosen ones moved him not at all, only sharpening his own quiet determination. He treats the ocean survival exactly like the strategy games he once played obsessively, reading every menu carefully, calculating every trade ratio. That obsessive attention to detail, once a harmless hobby wasted on virtual worlds that meant nothing beyond entertainment, had finally found a purpose worthy of every single hour he had ever poured into it, and refusing to waste a single resource on anything that does not directly improve his odds of reaching that distant island. When his talent quality enhancement orb, purchased cheaply off a desperate seller named Lai Chung, successfully pushes his 100 transformations talent up another tier, guaranteeing every future use raises an item's quality by at least one full grade, his greed only sharpens further. Windsor's true value reveals itself gradually, not just in raw combat power, but in her endlessly patient willingness to fish, cook, guard. It was that quiet, unglamorous patience, far more than any single dramatic battle, that convinced Hashin she was the single luckiest draw of his entire new life, worth more than any gold stone or epic weapon he would ever find. And comfort, her loyalty locked at maximum the moment she was summoned. Her affection slowly, genuinely growing with every small kindness he offers. Little Blue proves just as essential in his own way, an enormous, gentle engine of a whale who tows the ever-growing boat tirelessly. There was something almost meditative about watching that huge, powerful body cut steadily through the water day after day. A living reminder that strength and gentleness were never truly opposites in the first place. Devours entire schools of hostile fish in single bites, and greets Hashin every morning with an affectionate cry that presses warmth straight into his chest. Hashin's negotiations with fellow players reveal a consistent pattern. Generosity paid slightly above market rate combined with occasional public mercy builds. Far more lasting value than raw intimidation ever could. It was a lesson that had nothing to do with the system's mechanics and everything to do with plain, ordinary human nature. The same nature that had shaped every negotiation he ever watched or took part in back on Blue Star. A lesson he applies deliberately, calculating every act of kindness as an investment. Even his brutal decision to execute No Senna personally, rather than simply have Windsor finish her, is calculated. A way to train himself against the discomfort of killing his own kind. Before the stakes grow even higher, that deliberate hardening never fully erased the discomfort itself, only taught him to function through it. A distinction he considered important enough to hold onto even as the killing grew easier. With practice, understanding that squeamishness has no place in a world built on constant threat. The technology tree teaches him the harshest lesson of the entire voyage. That raw survival skill means little without capital. Every meaningful upgrade demanding thousands of white stone, turning his daily fishing and hunting into a relentless, exhausting arms race against his own growing needs. While with the fire spirit, barely 20 centimeters tall, becomes an unexpected emotional anchor for the whole crew, curling affectionately against Hashin's neck. Small as she was, her presence alone seemed to remind everyone aboard, Hashin included, that even in the middle of an endless, monster-infested ocean, warmth and tenderness could still find a place to survive. Charming even the stern Windsor into open, girlish delight. A tiny reminder of warmth in an otherwise brutal, rain-soaked world. Recruiting a chef named Mori and several nameless commoners slowly transforms Hashin's lonely plank into something resembling an actual household. Shared meals, shared chores, and the strange, unexpected comfort of a found family assembling itself in the middle of a hostile, monster-infested ocean. Every technology unlock forces Hashin into brutal arithmetic. Ship drainage costing hundreds of white stone just to light up, thermal energy costing more, propulsion power demanding thousands, until he realizes the entire tech tree is deliberately designed to bankrupt anyone who rushes it carelessly. He learns to prioritize ruthlessly, solving water and drainage first since drowning kills faster than starvation, then propulsion. Since a boat that cannot move is a coffin, treating every purchase like a survival triage decision rather than simple shopping. The Demon Domain event changes everything about his understanding of this world, revealing that rival lords summoned from other planets entirely, places with names like the Qianling Empire, are just as vulnerable, and just as capable of dying as any sea monster he has faced. Interrogating a captured rival lord named Hashin, before finally killing him, teaches Hashin something important: that different home civilizations produce lords with wildly different mindsets, and that understanding an enemy's origin matters as much as understanding their combat stats. Killing Demon Domain lords proves far more profitable than hunting sea beast ever could, each kill handing over their entire stockpile of resources plus rare merit points that ordinary survival never grants. Turning Hashin's brief raids into the single most lucrative activity available to him, he begins to suspect, correctly, that he is far from the only spirit domain lord who has figured out this loophole, and the realization sharpens his paranoia, knowing that the very same tactic that made him rich could just as easily be turned against him by someone stronger. A player named Wang Mok, initially terrified for his life, becomes an unlikely and genuinely loyal business partner, tasked with quietly gathering trade offers from across the world channel and bringing Hashin first pick of anything valuable before it disappears into the anonymous system shop. Hashin structures that arrangement carefully, letting Wang Mok earn a small commission on every deal he brokers, ensuring the man works hard purely out of self-interest, while Hashin himself never has to lift a finger managing the details personally. Every conversation in the world chat becomes a small chess match for Hashin, deploying calculated flattery, strategic silence, or cutting mockery depending entirely on which response best protects or expands his growing reputation as a lord not worth crossing, but always worth trading with. Watching rival players like Hagawa Haina rage uselessly in public chat teaches him a final lesson about this new world: that reputation, once properly built through consistent action rather than empty words, becomes nearly impossible for jealous rivals to tear down with mere accusations alone. The battle against the black-striped red-eyed lightning fish teaches Hashin a critical tactical lesson. Watching his crew scatter and regroup under real pressure for the first time, he realized just how much he had come to rely on their instincts, as much as his own careful planning. A partnership built through shared danger rather than simple command. Watching two coordinated blue-quality beasts deliberately split their attack between his hero and his weaker crew members, forcing him to trust Windsor completely to protect everyone at once. Windsor and Wawa's flawless teamwork against that pair of electric fish, one baiting while the other punishes, convinces Hashin that his two strongest companions have begun fighting together instinctively, a synergy no amount of careful planning could have manufactured on its own. Every piece of equipment Hashin recovers gets evaluated with the same cold calculation, never keeping an upgrade purely for himself, when it would serve Windsor's combat effectiveness better, understanding that her survival directly determines the survival of everyone else. Aboard his growing vessel, the Authority Light Staff, dropped from the Sea-Bright Twin Horn Beast, becomes Windsor's signature weapon for weeks. Its stealth skill and percentage boost to both light attribute strength and mana, transforming her from a merely strong hero into a genuinely terrifying one-on-one combatant. Discovering that killing monsters below his own level grants zero experience forces Hashin to rethink his entire hunting strategy, deliberately seeking out threats matched to his growing strength rather than farming easy, safe targets that would leave him permanently behind the leaderboard's pace. The glazed coral incident haunts him afterward, a stark reminder that Spirit Eye, his most trusted information tool, can still be fooled by stealth abilities, and that overconfidence in any single piece of information is its own unique kind of danger out here. Every night's ritual of feeding random items to his 100 transformations talent becomes something close to religious practice for Hashin, treating each guaranteed quality upgrade like unwrapping a gift he has already paid for, refusing to sleep until all 3 daily uses are spent. The decision to sell the entire uprooted Lingwen gold fruit tree, rather than attempt to transplant it, proves to be one of his smartest financial calls yet, converting an unusable, slow-growing treasure into full gold stone of immediately spendable wealth. Watching the terrifying royal procession approach across the underwater peak, Hashin catalogs everything he can see with cold, professional calm even as his heart pounds, recognizing that surviving this encounter unnoticed might matter more than any treasure he has found so far. He notices with a flicker of very human envy the dragon women and graceful mermaids flanking the third prince, and quietly resolves that if he survives long enough to build his own territory, he intends to surround himself with exactly that kind of loyal, beautiful company someday. Checking the survival leaderboard every single morning becomes an addictive ritual for Hashin, watching his own lead over second place stretch wider by the day. A small vicious satisfaction he allows himself even while reminding himself constantly not to grow careless. The merit point leaderboard reveals an important truth about this world. That raw luck in encountering rival lords matters just as much as strength. Since a player named Bakeseal vaults into second place purely by crossing paths, with more demon domain targets than anyone else, Hagawa Hein has repeated, increasingly bitter attempts to publicly shame Hashin in the world chat only ever backfire, the community consistently siding with cold hard evidence, screenshots, and testimonials over empty jealous accusations, hardening Hashin's understanding of how reputation actually functions here. Daily life aboard the slowly growing boat settles into an oddly domestic rhythm. Despite the constant danger, morning fishing, midday hunting expeditions, evening cooking lessons for Mori, and nightly talent rolls, a strange, hard-won version of home assembling itself one routine at a time. Hashin teaches himself to cook properly using ingredients fished from the sea and purchased through trade, discovering unexpected joy in something as simple as tomato and egg noodles. A small taste of his old world's comfort recreated entirely from scratch in an alien one. His growing collection of commoners, each with a simple profession like chef or laborer, slowly transforms his lonely survival story into something closer to genuine leadership, forcing him to think not just about his own advancement, but about feeding, housing, and protecting an entire small crew. The ship itself becomes a physical timeline of his progress, growing from a 3-meter plank into a 20-meter vessel complete with cabins, a warehouse, a fishing deck, and eventually genuine technology-powered propulsion. Each expansion a visible monument to relentless, disciplined grinding. Windsor's affinity toward Hashin climbed steadily through nothing more dramatic than consistent small kindnesses, shared meals, quiet concern for her safety, honest gratitude for her skill, proving that even in a world built on combat and survival, ordinary decency still compounds into something powerful. Hwa's role expands from simple mascot to genuine strategic asset, her fire-based skills proving crucial in coordinated combat, while her constant need for ship-charging duties ensures the boat can keep sailing through nights to dark and rain-soaked for ordinary navigation. By the time the Royal Dragon procession appears on the horizon, Hashin has quietly transformed from the most pitiful drifter on the entire ocean into arguably its single most resourceful survivor. A transformation built not on luck alone but on relentless, calculated daily effort. The compensation draw that started everything still feels, weeks later, like the single luckiest moment of Hashin's entire life. A random box that could have handed him nothing useful at all, instead delivering the exact tools needed to outpace an entire ocean full of desperate strangers. He thinks often about the loud, confident players who announced on day one that they intended to conquer the world, most of them already dead, or drowning in debt, while the quiet man who started with nothing but a plank now sits comfortably atop every leaderboard that matters. That contrast becomes its own private lesson for Hashin. That survival in this world rewards patient calculation far more than bold declarations, and that the loudest voice in the world chat is almost never the one still alive. By the end of the week, he keeps a running mental list of every mistake he has made, upgrading the fishing rod to early once, nearly drowning his crew in glazed coral, wasting a talent roll on an item too trivial to matter, and treats each one as tuition paid toward staying alive longer than his rivals. Every white stone earned, every skill stone learned, every technology unlocked feeds back into the same single, obsessive goal, reaching that black dot on his map fragment and finally planning a real territory before some rival lord, human or otherwise, beats him to it. The seawater converter, upgraded 3 separate times, becomes something of a personal victory lap for Hashin, watching a single liter of daily emergency water become a genuine, abundant supply capable of comfortably sustaining his entire growing crew without a second thought. Buying seeds cheaply while everyone else ignores them entirely proves to be one of his shrewdest long-term investments, quietly stockpiling vegetables, fruits, and grains he cannot yet plant, certain their value will explode the moment any lord finally claims real land. The flower-producing machine, pulling flour directly from the air itself, strikes Hashin as the single strangest piece of technology he has encountered so far. A small miracle of alien engineering he never fully stops marveling at, even as he takes it completely for granted within days. Building a proper cooler for the growing warehouse of looted food finally solves a problem Hashin had been quietly worrying over for days. Spoilage, transforming his hard-won stockpile from a ticking clock into genuine, stable long-term security. Even something as small as finally owning real bowls, chopsticks, and a working stove feels like enormous progress to a man who started this entire journey drenched, hungry, and straddling a single soaked plank in the middle of an indifferent gray ocean. The moment Hashin discovers that a dead sea beast corpse can be sold to the shop, separately from whatever item it drops, effectively doubling the value of every single kill, he feels a familiar thrill. The same rush he used to get finding a broken combo in an old strategy game. Except here the stakes are his own survival, and the reward is real white stone stacking steadily in an account that started only days ago, at exactly nothing at all. Every announcement from Shanmo gets picked apart by Hashin with the same paranoid, careful attention a soldier might give a battlefield briefing, reading not just what the goddess says outright, but what she deliberately leaves unsaid. Since a phrase as small as attacks from sea beast in the water told him plainly that attacks from somewhere else entirely, almost certainly the sky, were quietly, inevitably coming next. Trading with strangers taught Hashin more about this new world's economy in a single week than any system tutorial ever could. He kept every one of those lessons filed away carefully, certain that the same instinct serving him so well on open water would matter just as much once he finally reached solid ground and had to negotiate not with drifting strangers, but with an entire settled population depending on his judgment, watching prices shift in real time as players discovered new uses for old junk, watching desperation drive good deals, and confidence drive bad ones, and slowly learning that the man who stays calm, reads the room, and never lets greed show on his face will always walk away with the better half of any bargain, no matter how much white stone the other side started with. Every hero, pet, and skill stone Hashin acquired forced him to think several steps further ahead than simple, immediate power. He had come to see each new addition to his small crew not as another line on a stat sheet, but as another life he was now personally responsible for keeping fed, protected, and, whenever possible, genuinely happy. Weighing not just what a given item could do for him today, but what kind of long-term crew, defense, and economy he was quietly assembling piece by piece. The same patient instinct that once made him good at strategy games, now the very thing keeping him alive, fed, and steadily richer than every single rival drifting somewhere else on that same endless gray ocean. Looking back on the very first hour of this entire ordeal, soaked, furious, and convinced the universe had cheated him out of even a basic boat, Hashin can now see clearly that the plank itself was never truly the disadvantage it first appeared to be, but simply the opening move in a much longer game. One where starting from nothing forced him to think harder, plan further ahead, and value every single resource in a way that players handed an easy boat from the very first second never had any real reason to learn. The compensation draw, the epic talent, the legendary hero card, the loyal whale, the tiny fire spirit, none of it would have mattered nearly as much without the discipline Hashin brought to using it. Since he had watched plenty of other early lucky draws squandered by players too impatient or too careless to plan past the very next hour, proof that in this world, as in his old one, luck only ever pays out for the person patient enough to actually spend it wisely. Windsor herself had begun to notice, quietly, privately, the way this strange, calculating, occasionally teasing man treated every single member of his small crew, with the same careful attention he gave his own survival, never once wasting a kindness, but never once withholding one either when it was genuinely earned. And somewhere in the space between his blunt first question about whether she could fish, and the warm, steady arm he wrapped around her every single night since, she had stopped thinking of herself as simply a summoned hero fulfilling a contract, and started thinking of herself, quietly, cautiously, as something closer to family. Wawa, for her part, understood almost nothing of strategy or economy, or leaderboards, only that the tall man who fed her purple crystals and let her sleep curled against his neck was warm and safe and hers and in her small, uncomplicated fire spirit heart. That understanding was more than enough reason to burn herself out every single night, keeping his growing ship powered through storms that would have sunk lesser, colder crews within the very first week. The World Channel, still churning endlessly with strangers screaming about conquest and chosen destinies, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, begun to change its tone whenever Hashin's name came up, shifting from the mocking curiosity of the first day to something closer to genuine, grudging respect, a transformation earned entirely through consistent results rather than a single dramatic victory. The kind of reputation that survives scrutiny precisely because it was never built on empty boasting in the first place. Every rival lord who crossed Hashin's path now carried some fragment of secondhand warning with him. Whispered stories passed from Wang Mok to a dozen other traders and back again, embellished slightly with each retelling, until the broke nobody who once drifted on a single plank had become, in the space of less than 2 weeks, something dangerously close to a legend among the desperate, drowning masses of the spirit domain. Little Blue's growth from a modest 5-meter calf into a genuine ocean giant became its own quiet source of pride for Hashin. Every meal Hashin fed him, every gentle word offered after a hard-fought battle, every quiet hour spent simply floating beside the boat, had built a bond stronger than any contract or system generated loyalty stack could ever fully capture on a simple information panel. Watching the whale who once struggled to tow a simple 3-meter plank eventually haul an entire 20-meter vessel through open water, without so much as slowing his pace. Proof that patient, consistent care compounds just as powerfully in a loyal pet as it does in any hero or piece of technology. Every skill stone Hashin chose to hand over to Windsor rather than keep for himself reflected the same underlying philosophy that guided every other decision he made aboard that ship, that a lord's own personal power mattered far less than the total combined strength of everyone loyal to him, and that investing in his strongest ally would always pay greater dividends than hoarding scraps, purely for his own vanity. The steady accumulation of blueprints, most of them useless in the moment, but potentially priceless once real land was finally claimed, became something close to an obsession for Hashin, who treated every scrap of paper pulled from the sea as a small bet against a future he was absolutely certain he would live long enough to see. Watching other players squander their own lucky draws on flashy, immediate gratification, a fancy weapon here, an impulsive purchase there, only reinforced Hashin's growing conviction that the real winners of this brutal ocean survival would not be the boldest or the flashiest, but simply the ones patient enough to keep building quietly while everyone else celebrated too early. By the time the underwater mountain peak fell silent beneath that single, world-shaking dragon's roar, Hashin had already survived more genuine near-death encounters than he could easily count on both hands, each one leaving him sharper, more cautious, and more quietly confident that whatever waited in that royal procession, he had already earned the right to face it standing rather than fleeing. The friend requests that once flooded Hashin's panel on that very first chaotic day, most of them stayed unread and unanswered, deleted without a second thought. Because in a world this brutal, a genuine ally earned through shared danger was worth infinitely more than 100 strangers hoping to attach themselves to someone else's hard-won success. Dozens of strangers hoping to attach themselves to anyone who looked even slightly competent had slowly given way to something far more selective. A small, carefully chosen circle of genuinely useful contacts like Wang Mok and Lim He, each relationship built deliberately rather than accepted out of loneliness or desperation. Hashin had learned quickly that in a world this brutal, sentiment without utility was simply a liability waiting to sink you. And yet he never let that cold calculation fully override the quieter, more human instincts that kept pulling him toward small unnecessary kindnesses. An extra white stone here, a generous trade there. Proved to himself as much as anyone else that survival did not have to mean becoming someone he could no longer recognize. Every night, lying beside Windsor with Wawa curled somewhere nearby and Little Blue's low, contented cries drifting up faintly through the hull, Hashin found himself thinking less and less about the desperate, lonely life he had left behind on Blue Star, and more about the strange, hard-won, genuinely warm family this brutal ocean had somehow assembled around him. That warmth, more than any technology unlock or leaderboard position, had become the real prize of this entire ordeal. A truth Hashin was only beginning to admit to himself even as the terrifying royal procession bore down on the underwater peak where his small, hard-earned fortune currently hid in careful, breathless silence. Hashin's understanding of the goddess Chenmo herself had shifted considerably since that first panicked morning, from a distant, faceless system voice into something closer to an actual presence, one who genuinely listened when addressed directly, who fielded newbie questions with surprising patience, and who seemed, in her own quiet, careful way, to be rooting for at least some of the desperate souls she had scattered across this endless gray ocean. He had stopped assuming the compensation draw was some kind of cosmic apology, and started suspecting instead that Chanmo simply rewarded initiative, that the goddess who watched everything was far more interested in who complained productively and adapted quickly than in who simply drifted along waiting for rescue, a suspicion that shaped every decision he made from that very first morning onward. The technology tree's brutal costs, the endless white stone demands, the exponential upgrade curves, all of it began to feel less like deliberate cruelty and more like a carefully designed filter, one meant to separate the patient, resourceful survivors from the impulsive, unprepared ones long before any real territory or true danger ever entered the picture. Every purple and blue quality monster Hashin had survived taught him the same lesson, from a slightly different angle. That quality tier alone did not guarantee victory. That preparation, teamwork, and a willingness to retreat when the numbers genuinely did not favor him mattered just as much as raw combat power ever could. The moment Hashin first saw the map fragment resolve into a single glowing black dot against an endless field of empty blue, he felt something shift permanently inside him. The difference between simply surviving one more hour and actually working towards something. And he had carried that same feeling with him through every storm, every ambush, and every brutal technology purchase since. Looking at his crew now, Windsor fishing calmly beside him, Wawa dozing against his shoulder, Little Blue patrolling somewhere beneath the boat, Mori humming quietly over the evening's cooking, 3 loyal commoners tending their own small tasks. Hashin found it almost impossible to remember the raw, desperate panic of that very first morning, soaked and alone on a single drifting plank, with nothing but a sarcastic voice in his head for company. Whatever the third prince and his terrifying royal procession ultimately wanted with the underwater peak, Hashin understood one thing with total, unshakable clarity: that he had not clawed his way this far from absolute nothing just to freeze up and lose everything the moment real danger finally, truly arrived. Every single upgrade to the wooden boat carried its own small memory attached. The first plank becoming a raft, the raft gaining a cabin, the cabin expanding into a full living quarters with a warehouse and fishing deck. Each stage a physical record of exactly how far Hashin had come from that first humiliating morning, when even the goddess herself had to admit a mistake had been made. The seawater converter, once a desperate emergency measure squeezing out a single liter a day, now produced enough fresh water to comfortably bathe, cook, and drink for an entire growing crew. A small domestic miracle that Hashin still occasionally paused to appreciate in the middle of an otherwise brutal, unforgiving survival grind. Windsor had started, almost without either of them noticing exactly when it began, finishing Hashin's sentences during battle, anticipating which target he wanted focused next, which threat needed binding first, a wordless coordination built entirely from days of fighting, eating, and surviving side by side. The commoners aboard, nameless and skillless as the system described them, had proven themselves indispensable in their own quiet way, fishing tirelessly through storms, hauling supplies without complaint, and slowly earning small gestures of gratitude from a lord who understood perfectly well that an empire built on invisible, unappreciated labor was an empire built on sand. Maury's growing confidence in the kitchen, from a nervous first attempt at scrambled eggs to genuinely impressive shared meals for the whole crew, mirrored the confidence growing throughout the entire small floating household. Each small daily success compounding into something that felt, unmistakably, like actual progress rather than mere survival. Hashin often found himself wondering what the other 4,000 or so surviving players scattered across the same disaster month were experiencing right now. Whether any of them had found their own version of Windsor, their own Little Blue, their own small found family assembling itself out of pure desperate necessity. That thought never lasted long, though, because out here, sentiment for strangers was a luxury, and the only family that truly mattered was the one currently watching a terrifying royal procession approach across an underwater peak, waiting to see whether their careful, hard-won stealth would hold. Every purple quality kill Hashin's crew had survived left behind not just loot, but a kind of hardened confidence, the certainty that whatever the ocean threw at them next, they had already proven capable of surviving something worse. A psychological edge that mattered just as much as any equipment upgrade. In a world this consistently, relentlessly hostile, the steady stream of blueprints pulled from resource fishing, most of them useless in the moment, had begun to form the outline of an entire future settlement in Hashin's mind. Walls, arrow towers, a proper blacksmith, defenses he could not yet build, but had already quietly stockpiled the plans for. Patient investment in a future he refused to let himself doubt. Windsor's transformation from a formerly polite, slightly startled legendary hero into someone who genuinely laughed, teased back, and curled instinctively against Hashin every single night had happened so gradually that neither of them could point to the exact moment it occurred. Only that it had, undeniably, completely. The first time Hashin killed another human being, that trembling, begging demon domain lord who refused to simply answer a question. Something in him had genuinely recoiled. A nausea that had nothing to do with the blood, and everything to do with crossing a line he never expected to cross back on Blue Star, where the worst thing he had ever done was lose an argument in an online game. By the time he executed no Senna days later, that same nausea had doled into something closer to grim, professional necessity, not because he had become cruel, but because he had learned the hard way. That mercy extended to someone actively trying to kill him was not virtue but simple recklessness. A lesson every survivor in this brutal ocean eventually had to learn or else stop surviving entirely. He kept that hardening carefully separate from the rest of himself, refusing to let it bleed into how he treated Windsor, Wawa, Little Blue, or his small crew of commoners, dry and clear. deliberate line between the cold calculation required to survive rival lords and the genuine warmth he still allowed himself with the people who had chosen to stay loyal to him. That balance, ruthless when necessary, generous when possible, had become the actual philosophy underlying everything Hashin did. Whether haggling over a soldier nest blueprint, executing a treacherous rival, or simply deciding which random item to feed his talent each night, a consistent internal logic that made him, without him ever quite intending it, a genuinely fair man to trade with and a genuinely dangerous one to cross. The steady rhythm of rain that had defined every single day since Hashin first woke on that plank had started to feel less like a disaster and more like simple weather. Background noise to a life that had reorganized itself entirely around fishing schedules, hunting expeditions, technology grinding, and the quiet comfort of a warm meal shared with people who genuinely cared. Whether he came back from each day's danger, he thought sometimes, late at night, with Windsor breathing softly against his shoulder, about how strange it was that a random compensation draw handed out by an indifferent cosmic system had somehow assembled the closest thing to a real family he had ever known. Closer than any relationship he had managed to build in an entire lonely childhood, spent bouncing between government assistance programs on a planet that never once felt like home. Whatever waited for him beyond that terrifying royal procession, whatever the third prince ultimately wanted, whatever island still lay somewhere out past the edge of his map fragment, Hashin found himself, for the first time since waking soaked and furious on a single wooden plank, genuinely unafraid of what came next. Not because the danger had lessened, but because he finally had people worth fighting to protect. Every conversation Hashin had with fellow survivors in the world chat carried a small hidden test buried inside it. Some players failed that test instantly, revealing greed or desperation within their very first sentence, while others, like Lim Hee and Bangwol, passed simply by being straightforward. And Hashin rewarded that honesty every single time with fair, sometimes even generous, trade terms, watching not just what people asked for, but how they asked, whether they led with genuine need, or empty flattery, whether they respected a boundary once it was drawn. Small signals that told him within seconds whether someone was worth a second exchange, or simply another desperate voice to politely ignore. The countdown timers scattered throughout the shop interface, the weekly technology card, the disaster month itself, all reinforced the same underlying truth Hashin had internalized from the very first day. That time in this world was a resource just as real, and just as limited as white stone or wood, and that every hour spent hesitating was an hour some other lord was spending building an advantage that might one day prove fatal. He had started measuring his own progress not against some abstract ideal of a perfect lord, but simply against the version of himself from 3 days earlier, a little stronger, a little richer, a little more prepared, a metric that made the endless grinding feel less like an impossible mountain, and more like a series of achievable, satisfying small victories stacked one on top of another. Little Blue's hunting habits had grown noticeably more sophisticated over the past week, no longer simply charging blindly into every school of fish, but pausing, circling, assessing threats the way Hashin himself had learned to. Proof that even a summoned pet could absorb and reflect the careful, patient instincts of the lord who fed and trusted him. The sheer variety of creatures Hashin's small crew had encountered, wolves shaped like catfish, foxes that froze the sea itself, octopi that vomited entire clouds of blinding ink, had reshaped his entire mental model of danger, teaching him that no single strategy would ever work twice, and that adaptability mattered more than any fixed combat routine ever could. Every night's talent roll carried its own small ritual of hope and disappointment, sometimes a triumphant epic drop that left the whole crew celebrating, sometimes a disappointingly minor upgrade that Hashin absorbed with a philosophical shrug, understanding that even guaranteed positive change still left plenty of room for merely modest results. The two lovely dragon women and the graceful mermaids flanking the third prince represented a level of established, generational power that no human lord, no matter how quickly they climbed a leaderboard, could hope to match within a single disaster month. A humbling reminder that survival and true dominance were still two very different achievements. To Hashin's calculating mind, something far more significant than simple royal decoration, evidence of an entire sea race civilization with its own hierarchy, its own culture, and quite possibly its own agenda that had nothing whatsoever to do with the desperate human lords, currently scattered across the ocean's surface, watching hundreds of giant black pythons and towering azure flood dragons escort a literal floating palace. Hashin found himself recalculating everything he thought he understood about the true scale of power in this world, realizing with cold clarity that everything he had survived so far, wolves, leopards, rival lords, had all been happening in what amounted to this continent's shallow end. That realization did not paralyze him the way it might have on his very first day here, soaked, and alone on a single plank with no context for any of this, but instead sharpened his focus, reminding him that every hard-won lesson from the past week, patience, calculation, loyalty, generosity when it counted, would matter more now than ever before. Hashin's discipline around resource management had become almost second nature by this point, never spending white stone on impulse, always calculating exactly how many upgrades a given windfall could fund, before deciding what to prioritize, a habit that separated him sharply from the players he watched blow entire fortunes on flashy, unnecessary purchases within hours of earning them. The fishing rods he had upgraded and distributed among his crew represented a small, quiet investment strategy of their own, spreading his income generation across multiple hands rather than relying on a single lucky catch, ensuring that even an ordinary day without any dramatic encounters still produced a steady, reliable trickle of white stone by evening. Every blueprint Hashin declined to build immediately: the ice cream maker, the refrigeration unit, sat carefully cataloged in his memory as a future possibility rather than dead weight, proof of a mind that had learned to see potential value in almost everything, rather than dismissing anything that did not offer immediate, obvious utility. The steady procession of dead demon domain lords, each one leaving behind a small windfall of resources, had begun to feel almost routine to Hashin by the third or fourth encounter, a grim efficiency replacing the nervous uncertainty of his very first kill. Though he never let that efficiency slide into carelessness, always checking an opponent's true strength before committing his crew to any fight. Wang Mok's growing network of trade contacts had quietly become one of Hashin's most valuable assets, a small, informal intelligence operation that fed him first pick of every worthwhile item circulating through the world channel, all built from a single moment of unexpected mercy that could just as easily have ended in another meaningless death. Every skill Windsor learned: entangling spell, bewilder, freezing spell, layered together into a combat style that no longer resembled the simple healing support role she had first introduced herself with, evolving instead into something closer to a genuine battlefield controller capable of locking down threats far above her own nominal level. Every time Hashin pulled a fresh blueprint from the resource fishing rod, he ran the same quick mental calculation: whether to build it immediately, sell it for quick cash, or bank it against some future need he could not yet fully predict. A decision framework refined through dozens of small trial and error mistakes over the course of just a single week. The rain that had once felt like an unrelenting punishment on that very first soaked, miserable morning had gradually become something closer to a familiar companion, tracked carefully through Chamo's daily disaster announcements, planned around rather than simply endured. Another variable folded neatly into Hashin's increasingly sophisticated survival routine. Mori's kitchen, once a single borrowed stove and one cast iron pot, had grown into something resembling an actual functioning galley, stocked with flour synthesized from thin air, vegetables grown inside a magical planting box, and fresh fish delivered daily by a crew of loyal fishers. Proof that even in the middle of a monster-infested ocean, real comfort could still be built by hand. Hashin often thought about the strange, almost accidental nature of leadership he had backed into, never setting out to command anyone, only ever trying to survive one more day, and yet somehow accumulating a whale, a legendary hero, a fire spirit, a chef, and 3 loyal commoners simply by consistently making decisions that put their well-being ahead of his own convenience. The survival leaderboard's steady climb from a shaky early lead to a commanding, nearly insurmountable gap over second place had stopped feeling like luck sometime around the third day, and started feeling like the natural, inevitable result of simply refusing to stop working even when exhausted, hungry, or genuinely afraid. Every single encounter with a stronger, more dangerous sea beast left Hashin slightly more confident than the last, not because the danger had lessened, but because he had proven to himself, repeatedly, that careful preparation and a willingness to retreat, when necessary, could overcome even a significant gap in raw combat power. The single fixed-point teleportation blueprint Hashin had transformed from a discarded pair of underwear sat unused in his inventory like a loaded emergency switch, a reminder that even his most careful planning still left room for the unexpected, and that sometimes the smartest preparation was simply having one clean escape route ready before you ever actually needed it. Windsor's growing collection of equipment, the Authority Light Staff, the Green Ring, the Emerald Hairpin, told its own quiet story of devotion. Every single upgrade chosen deliberately to make her stronger rather than to decorate her. Proof that Hashin's affection expressed itself not through empty gestures, but through genuinely useful, carefully considered gifts. Hua's tiny frame belied a genuinely fierce combat spirit. diving headfirst into fights against creatures many times her size without hesitation, trusting completely that Windsor and Little Blue would cover whatever gaps her small stature left exposed. The same total, uncomplicated loyalty that made the entire crew function as a single cohesive unit, rather than a collection of separate individuals. Every prayer Hashin had half-jokingly whispered to the King of Luck before his very first talent role now felt, in retrospect, almost quaint compared to the deliberate, calculated strategy he applied to every decision aboard his growing ship. A transformation from a man hoping for rescue into a man actively building his own salvation, one careful choice at a time. The steady rain that pounded the deck every single day had become, strangely, one of the few genuinely peaceful constants in Hashin's new life. A backdrop to quiet mornings fishing beside Windsor, evenings cooking with Mori, and nights spent cataloging the day's haul while Wawa slept curled warm against his neck. He had stopped counting the days since waking on that single plank sometime around the end of the first week. Not because the milestone stopped mattering, but because counting forward toward the island on his map fragment had become a far more meaningful measure of time than simply counting backward from disaster. Watching the royal procession's demi-human soldiers stand at perfect, disciplined attention along the palace railings, Hashin found himself grateful in a strange, roundabout way for every single brutal lesson the ocean had already taught him, since without those countless smaller dangers, he would never have developed the patience needed to simply wait, watch, and let a far greater threat pass by unnoticed. Hashin found himself studying their formation with the same careful attention he gave any potential threat, noting weapon types, apparent hierarchy, and the unmistakable sense that whatever civilization built that floating palace had been organizing armies for far longer than any human lord on this ocean. The dragon women and mermaids flanking the third prince moved with a practiced, elegant grace that told Hashin they were far more than simple decoration, likely capable fighters or advisors in their own right. A detail that shifted his assessment of the prince from a merely powerful figure into someone surrounded by genuine, competent strength on every side. Whatever happened next, Hashin understood one thing with total clarity, that the quiet, careful survival strategy that had carried him from a single soaked plank to the top of every leaderboard on this ocean was about to be tested against something far larger and far older than any sea beast or rival lord he had faced so far. Every single lesson Hashin had absorbed since that first chaotic morning, patience over impulse, generosity over pure greed, loyalty earned rather than demanded, calculation over blind courage, had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment. A genuine unknown far beyond anything the survival guides or world chatter could have warned him about. He glanced once at Windsor, steady and watchful beside him, at Wawa curled quietly against his shoulder, at the faint ripple in the water marking, where Little Blue waited patiently below the surface, and felt, despite the very real danger bearing down on them, a strange, subtle confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with trust, earned the hard way. Whatever the third prince wanted, whatever the sea race's true intentions toward the scattered human lords turned out to be, Hashin intended to meet it the same way he had met every other impossible obstacle. Since waking on that single drifting plank, carefully, patiently, and with people beside him worth fighting for, somewhere in the back of his mind, Hashin filed away every detail of the royal procession for later. The exact number of pythons, the specific coloring of the flood dragons, the layout of the floating palace itself, cataloging information the same disciplined way he cataloged blueprints and skill stones, treating even a moment of genuine danger as an opportunity to learn something valuable. That habit, born from a lifetime of having nothing and needing to make the absolute most of every scrap of information available, had quietly become one of Hashin's greatest strengths in this new world, transforming him from a man who simply reacted to danger into one who studied it, learned from it, and grew stronger because of it. The world channel's endless scroll of panic, celebration, and rivalry had become background noise Hashin could parse in seconds each morning, sorting genuine useful intelligence from empty bragging with the same efficiency he applied to sorting blueprints from junk, a skill that saved him countless hours he could instead spend fishing, hunting, or simply resting beside the people who had come to matter most. Every gold stone Hashin accumulated felt less like personal wealth and more like fuel for the territory he had not yet built, a future settlement he pictured increasingly clearly. Walls rising from a real island, farms growing real crops without needing magical acceleration, and a crew of loyal companions finally given solid ground to call home instead of an endless, shifting ocean. Windsor had begun, in small unguarded moments, imagining what that future territory might actually look like. She pictured a real kitchen for Mori, a proper training yard for herself, a warm den somewhere for Little Blue to rest between hunts, Small domestic dreams that would have felt impossibly frivolous during her very first terrified days as a newly summoned hero, and yet now felt entirely, comfortably natural. A real house instead of a cramped cabin, a real garden instead of a magical planting box, and found herself, to her own quiet surprise, genuinely hoping Hashin would let her help build it rather than simply protect it, wanting to be more than just his strongest weapon. Hashin, for his part, had already started sketching rough mental blueprints of his own. A territory built not just for defense but for genuine comfort, remembering every small domestic victory of these past days. The noodles, the bedding, the window blueprint he still hadn't built, and promising himself that whatever came of this royal encounter, that future was still worth fighting toward. Every skill stone Hashin had chosen not to sell, but to hold in reserve. Shadow lurked chief among them, represented a quiet bet on the future. A belief that eventually the right hero, or the right moment would arrive to make that dormant power worth far more than any quick sale ever could. The steady accumulation of seeds purchased, while everyone else ignored them cheap, represented the same patient philosophy, applied to agriculture rather than combat. A belief that the value of preparation always reveals itself eventually, usually right, when the unprepared realize too late what they should have stockpiled first. The steady drumbeat of daily check-ins, fishing sessions, and technology purchases had transformed what once felt like desperate improvisation into something closer to a genuine daily discipline. A routine Hashin could rely on even when the surrounding ocean offered nothing but uncertainty and constant, unpredictable danger. Every hero card, pet card, and skill stone that passed through Hashin's hands eventually found its proper place, whether kept, gifted, or sold, sorted by the same patient calculation that had turned a single soaked plank into a genuine floating fortress within the span of barely more than a week. Windsor sometimes caught herself thinking back to the exact moment she had materialized at the bow of that tiny 3-meter boat, expecting perhaps gratitude, perhaps awe, and receiving instead a blunt, pragmatic question about her fishing ability, and she had come to realize, gradually, that this unglamorous first impression had been the truest possible introduction to the man she now trusted completely. Huawa curled contentedly against Hashin's shoulder as the boat sailed onward through the endless rain, understood none of the political weight behind a royal procession, or the strategic calculations behind a technology purchase, only that her lord was safe, her family was together, and the warm, steady rhythm of the ship beneath her was exactly where she belonged. Little Blue's powerful, tireless strokes carried the ship forward through waters that had nearly killed its passengers dozens of times over, a living testament to the same principle that had carried Hashin through every disaster. Since his very first morning, that loyalty given honestly and returned generously could outlast almost any danger this world had to offer. Mori had grown, over these strange, storm-soaked days, from a nervous, newly summoned commoner into something like the quiet emotional center of the whole crew, her cooking a small daily ritual that pulled everyone together around a shared table, regardless of how dangerous the day's fishing or hunting had been. The 3 ordinary commoners aboard, each summoned with nothing more than a blank profession and a basic fishing rod, had never once complained about the endless rain or the constant threat of ambush, finding instead a strange contentment in simply having a place, a purpose, and a lord who noticed and appreciated their steady, unglamorous work. That appreciation, expressed through small gestures rather than grand speeches, an extra piece of fruit here, a moment of genuine thanks there, had built a loyalty among Hashin's entire crew that no amount of raw system-generated loyalty stats could ever fully capture or explain. Every single decision Hashin made in those first frantic hours, upgrading the plank instead of hoarding wood, the very first time he ever spoke aloud to Chemo, half joking, half furious, demanding to know if the goddess had made a mistake, he never expected an actual answer. And that single moment of pure, unfiltered honesty had somehow become the foundation of everything that followed. He has never once stopped talking to her since, sometimes complaining, sometimes genuinely grateful, treating the distant, watching goddess less like an untouchable deity and more like a stern, occasionally generous landlord he has slowly, grudgingly come to respect, testing the talent orb immediately instead of hesitating, chasing the map fragment's black dot with total commitment, had compounded across the following days into an advantage no rival lord seemed capable of closing. Proof that early decisiveness mattered as much as raw luck ever could. The steady, patient rhythm of his daily routine, fish in the morning, hunt in the afternoon, trade and build in the evening, roll the talent at night, had become so ingrained that Hashin sometimes forgot how chaotic and desperate those very first hours had actually felt. Back when survival meant nothing more than keeping his head above freezing gray water, somewhere out on that same endless gray ocean. Every single lord still drifting, still fighting, still hoping, represents a version of the same story Hashin lived through himself. Desperation slowly, painfully transformed into either genuine strength or quiet, forgotten defeat, depending entirely on how much patience and discipline each survivor could summon when it mattered most. Thousands of other players were still fighting their own private versions of Hashin's story. Some thriving, most struggling, a handful already lost entirely to storms, starvation, or monsters too strong to survive, and Hashin never forgot, even in his own quiet success, how thin the line between his own triumph and their tragedy actually was. That awareness kept him humble in ways his growing wealth and power might otherwise have eroded. A quiet reminder every time he checked the shrinking survivor count that his own current safety was built on a foundation of careful choices rather than any guaranteed cosmic favor, and that the same ocean could just as easily have swallowed him whole on any one of a dozen different days. Every technology card Hashin had purchased at full price during those early desperate days now looked, in hindsight, like a genuine bargain compared to the exponentially rising cost facing anyone who had not started stockpiling white stone from the very first hour. Another small reminder that patience and early action together beat either quality alone. The steady rhythm of Wang Mok's daily trade reports had become one of Hashin's most reliable sources of quiet information about the wider world. Beyond his own boat, even Hagawa Haina, still bitterly grumbling somewhere out on the water, had unknowingly done Hashin a favor, every failed attempt at public humiliation only reinforcing, more convincingly than any of Hashin's own words ever could, exactly how far ahead of the pack he had already pulled, revealing not just useful items for sale, but subtle shifts in the overall survivor population's mood, confidence, and desperation as the disaster month wore steadily onward. Hashin often reflected that the version of himself who had first opened his system panel, in a state of pure panic, would barely recognize the calm, calculating lord now watching a royal procession pass safely by. Proof that even a single week of consistent, disciplined effort could reshape a person almost as thoroughly as it reshaped a battered wooden plank into a genuine ship. Whatever trials still waited beyond that black dot on his map fragment, Hashin carried with him now something far more valuable than any single piece of equipment or blueprint, the hard-won knowledge that he could face genuine terror, hold steady, and still come out the other side with everyone he cared about safely intact. The prince's gaze lingers on the hidden peak for one long, breathless moment, and Hashin holds perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on Windsor's shoulder, trusting the stealth cloak, trusting his crew, trusting the same careful discipline that had carried him this far, without once needing to gamble everything on blind luck alone. Then, just as slowly as it arrived, the prince's attention drifts elsewhere, the procession continuing its stately march across the open water, the roar of pythons and flood dragons fading gradually into the endless gray distance, leaving the underwater peak once again silent, undisturbed, and for now, safely theirs. Hashin lets out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and beside him, Windsor exhales the same relief, her hand finding his in the quiet aftermath, while Wawa stirs sleepily against his neck, and somewhere below, Little Blue's low, contented cry signals that the danger has truly passed. That single, terrifying near-miss becomes, in its own strange way, the clearest confirmation yet of everything Hashin has built since waking soaked and furious on a single wooden plank. That careful preparation, loyal companions, and the discipline to wait rather than panic can carry a person through even the most impossible odds. He does not know yet what waits beyond the black dot on his map fragment, what kind of island, what kind of territory. He thinks sometimes about the boy he used to be, alone, broke, and raised on nothing but government aid. A boy who never once imagined that a random cosmic mistake could hand him a family. This genuine, this loyal, this worth protecting. Every hardship of this strange new world, the rain, the monsters, the constant financial grind, feels almost worth it when weighed against the quiet, steady warmth of a crew that chose to stay loyal simply because he chose to treat them well first. That, more than any leaderboard position or gold stone total, has become the real measure of success Hashin cares about now, not how much he has accumulated, but how many people genuinely want to keep sailing beside him. What kind of future he is still sailing toward, but he knows, with total certainty now, that he will not be facing any of it alone. Windsor beside him, Wawa curled against his shoulder, Little Blue patient and powerful beneath the waves, Mori and his small loyal crew tending the ship that started as nothing more than a soaked. Somewhere behind them, the rival lords still screaming in the world chat about conquest and destiny remain exactly where they started, loud, ambitious, and increasingly, unmistakably, left behind. Hashin never set out to be anyone's example, only to survive one more day. And yet somehow, quietly, methodically, he has become the exact proof every desperate drifter on this ocean needed. That starting with nothing does not mean staying with nothing. Mocked piece of timber, all of it earned, none of it given freely. Exactly the way Hashin has always preferred it. Somewhere ahead, an entire island waits, unclaimed, unbuilt, full of possibility. And Hashin intends to reach it not as the desperate, soaked nobody who first opened his eyes on a single plank, but as a man who has already proven, a dozen times over, exactly what he is capable of building from nothing. The rain keeps falling, steady and familiar now instead of miserable, and the boat sails on toward that distant black dot, carrying not just cargo and white stone, but the quiet, hard-won beginning of an actual home. That, in the end, is the whole story of the man who woke up with nothing but a plank, and a goddess's grudging apology and built, one careful decision at a time, an empire worth protecting.